Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to another episode of the Brave New Weed podcast, high-minded conversations for the post-prohibition era. I'm your host, Joe Dolce, as always, and joining me is the inimitable Matthew Hendershot. Matthew, welcome.
Joe, super happy to be back on the podcast. I know I was away for a while. I missed some great interviews that you had while I was gone, but I'm back in action now and happy to be
Well, now you have to devote a few hours to catching up with us.
Oh, I've already done it.
Okay.
I listened to them as they came out.
Great. So this is an interesting episode, especially for people who are growing at home, because we managed to get Jim Hole, who's the VP of Cultivation for Atlas Growers in Canada, which is one of the largest pharmaceutical, flower and cannabis producers in the state of Calgary. And he's going to tell us how home growers can really do a better job of growing. So stay tuned for that. It's really good. I want to talk to you first, though, if there's any announcements you want to make, or do we have any news to discuss?
We definitely have some news. I don't have any announcements per se, but if you want, we can jump straight into the news.
My one announcement is ask you for your support. We ask you for your support every week, and it really matters. It's what helps keep us going and growing. It's easy to support us. You can support us at any level you're comfortable with. Matthew, where can they find the links?
Absolutely. Anyone who wants to personally support the show, you can obviously go to bravenewweed.com, where all of your Brave New Weed information is kept and located. And there you will find links to the Patreon, or you can go straight to patreon.com/bravenewweed to sign up and become a patron at any of our available reward levels.
So what news do we have to discuss this week, sir?
Well, unfortunately, it's not the best story out there, but I do think it's super important to discuss with our listeners that recently a rash of reports have been coming in regarding an uptick in a respiratory condition called sudden acute respiratory distress syndrome. And it's commonly known as SARS or ARDS. And lately it has hospitalized more than 200 people across the United States and unfortunately claimed its first casualty in the form of a man from Illinois. The problem with this is the CDC is urging doctors to dig into these cases because they're found now a very clear link between these SARS and ARDS cases and vaping or e-cigarettes. And it's actually even taken on the name of wet lung or vape lung.
What a disgusting word. But this is not cannabis specific. This is vape, mostly those vaping cigarettes, right?
That's true. A lot of these cases are directly related to e-cigarette products because there's a lot of, vaguity about what needs to be listed on those packages and products.
Like nothing.
However,
it's not a regulated substance. Nothing needs to be regulated on them, and frequently nothing is.
Right. However, unfortunately, there are 7 people that have been reported cases in California that have directly been traced back to potentially tainted THC vaporization cartridges that were specifically purchased on the black market.
So a takeaway is do not buy vape cartridges on the black market.
Yeah, that's a big thing. The CDC, FDA, and state health departments are all working together right now to try and pin down the mechanism. They're not sure the specific culprit causing this. Potential causes right now could be the liquids used to thin the nicotine and THC oils, potentially unregulated smell and flavor additives put in this, or even potentially the mechanical cartridges themselves, many of which are just bought for black market purposes off of like Amazon from Chinese manufacturers.
So I think the takeaway for cannabis vapors is know what's in your cartridges. Avoid ingredients like propylene glycol. I think those flavorings are really strange and very suspect, and God knows what they're doing. And try not to buy the cheapest vaporizing pens. Try to up your game a little bit. And, what you're putting into your lungs really matters to the rest of your health. wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think that I think the takeaway is twofold for our listeners. First and foremost, as you said, if you're going to get e-cigarette products or THC cartridge to vaporize, make sure you are getting it from a certified, tested, and licensed source with clear labeling so that you can know the ingredients. The other thing, and as I said, it's not the most nice thing to put out there, but if you are vaping cigarette products, nicotine products, or THC products, and you experience any sort of shortness of breath, coughing, fatigue, chest pain, tightness in your chest, difficulty breathing, or even abdominal pain, go to the emergency room, tell them you have been vaping, and speak directly to a doctor.
And first, just stop vaping. I mean,
there is something to be said about that.
If you're feeling symptoms like that, just stop for a while. Vaping cannabis products is not supposed to cause any of those problems. It's supposed to actually eliminate them. So if you are having problems, give it up.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think people who are already experiencing symptoms and things like that, just stopping is not going to be enough.
Understood.
A lot of the times, these people are going to the doctors, and it's being misdiagnosed as just respiratory infections. And this ARDS syndrome is not going to be treatable with an antibacterial or an antibiotic. Like, that's just not going to cut it.
What's the next item of news on our agenda?
Well, actually, Joe, this was something that you brought up to me, which was very interesting. And this was a dump of documents that came out of the recent passing of this Ms. Cordelia Skye.
So Cordelia Skye was a progressive who ended up coming down very hard on immigrants to the point where she was even advocating forced sterilization to keep the population of immigrants down. And she has given millions of dollars to support right-wing causes in the United States. And really, many of the organizations she supported built the foundation of Trump's immigration policy. This is not a podcast about immigration, folks. It's about cannabis. But what struck me is that it was remarkably reminiscent to the actions of another woman in Canada named Emily Murphy, who again started out as a progressive and started going into this was a long time ago, by the way, in the Victorian era. She started looking at hospitals and started noticing that a lot of the workers who had been brought over from China to build the Trans-Pacific Railway in Canada were Asian. And some of them were addicted to opium. And she fought very hard to create racial laws and anti-drug laws. And as a matter of fact, she included cannabis in her anti-drug screeds, which some people think really influenced Canada to actually ban cannabis before anybody ever used it. We're talking in the early 1900s here. Cannabis was not a Canadian product. It wasn't grown naturally in Canada. They had no reports of anyone ever using it. But because she was so virulent in her anti-drug campaign, they just included it in these acts. And that's how Canadian prohibition actually began. This is also quite reminiscent of how racism was used to ban cannabis in the 1930s in the United States. Now, I'm not saying Cordelia, I'm just sort of free associating here. There's Cordelia Skye, was not a drug warrior as far as I know. But this weird connection between racism and immigration and drugs is something that just keeps happening. And it's very interesting to see and very good to know the history of this stuff and to see how it all gets tied into creating waves and waves of fear in the native populations. I don't know, Matthew, did you have any response to any of that stuff?
I mean, it is quite curious what you brought up. Obviously, when you start talking about the origins of prohibition in the United States and the work of, like Harry Anslinger, and that it was tied directly, cannabis was tied to the Mexican immigration that was coming in at the time. And it was just, yeah, we do sort of find ourselves in a curious place to where the conversation about immigration is just at a fever pitch. And it is curious what you bring up about this sort of repetition of history and whether or not this sort of racist history of prohibition will find a way to repeat itself as people get more and more worked up. It's curious that right now the United States is seeing such an influx of support for legalization. However, you're right. It could take just a couple of people in a backroom meeting to sort of turn that corner around, I suppose.
I don't think anybody's drawing the connection between immigration and cannabis legalization, frankly. I think, I'm just making these assumptions because I know the history, and I think it's interesting to know the history of racism and legalization. My contention is that legalization could be one of Trump's paths to re-election if he's smart. But what I've always thought, and I think I've said on the podcast a couple of times, is that he's got a problem with the Christian right in terms of cannabis legalization. They're really opposed to this, and that's a major voting block of his. That's why I think he's kept quiet about all this. What do you think?
I don't know if I actually see it as being this big block of the Christian right. Maybe it's just from conversations like we've had on the show recently with our recent pastor friend who talked about the changing approach to cannabis from Christians. Craig.
Yeah.
But I also just don't see it being that much of a hot button issue. And I do think that, that Christian right, that Trump base is going to stay with Trump. Like, he's not really going to scare him away by talking about cannabis. They're more concerned about abortion and immigration and all these sort of like bigger ticket items. And I just think that there's a way that the Republicans can spin it to be a personal freedom argument and an economic one. And I think that both of those things can appeal to staunch, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans and kind of appeal to that undecided independent middle ground.
Well, frankly, I think the Democrats can do the same. I think they should have done it in the last election, but that's water under the bridge.
Well, I think you're going to see that fight this year, certainly.
I don't.
I mean, it's already one of the number one talking planks. So
I just don't, but let's see what happens. I mean, it's early, and God knows it's pretty hard to predict politics right now.
It'll be curious to see the political party that claims legalization as their own loudest and first.
Yeah, I await. Let's see what that day brings.
The Brave New Weed podcast is an advocate and supporter of the Medical Cannabis Mentor platform. Medical Cannabis Mentor is an evidence-based educational platform for doctors, dispensaries, and patients that uses state-of-the-art online learning technology to educate you in today's modern cannabis world. You can find out more information by visiting medicalcannabismentor.com.
This week's guest is Jim Hole. Jim is the VP of Cultivation at Atlas Growers in Canada. They are growing pharmaceutically viable cannabis flower and making products that are cultivated in a state-of-the-art facility that's about 40,000 square feet. Jim is a really smart guy, and we asked him on the show so he could talk about what it really requires to grow excellent cannabis in an indoor environment. We want to take some of his knowledge and share it with you, the listeners, who are interested in growing or even starting a grow somewhere indoors. So let's listen to what Jim has to say. Okay, Jim, this is Jim Hole. Jim, tell me your title, please, at Atlas Growers. Tell me the full title, the full proper name of the company as well.
Yeah, so it's Atlas Biotechnologies, and I'm the Vice President of Cultivation with them.
Biotechnologies is a very serious word, Jim. What does it mean exactly?
Well, I think what it really means is that Atlas is the kind of company that is really fully exploring the science of cannabis. So I think you look at companies that grow cannabis, great. Atlas kind of goes one step further. And so the biotech encompasses that philosophy of really understanding the science of the plants. And it is a medicinal producer of cannabis. So it's really focused on the high quality of the cannabis and ensuring that it is grown properly and safely.
So just break it down a little bit for me. I still don't understand. Biotechnology is a very big word. I'm not really sure what it means. Does it mean you use a particular type of fertilizer, a particular type of grow technique, a particular kind of watering technique? Make it clear to people like me with small brains, please.
I think it's kind of all of the above. So when I came on with Atlas, having discussions with the various company executives, I said that what we have to do is approach this from a very, very scientific perspective, which means that every aspect of the cannabis cultivation is thoroughly investigated, and only knowing exactly what goes into the crop is critical for growing the kind of crop we want to grow for medicinal purposes. So that means that, if you look at the fertilizer, control every aspect of that. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, all the things that go into the crop are very, very tightly controlled. It's an indoor environment. Lighting is tightly controlled. We know exactly when the lights go on, when they go off, the intensity, changing intensity on the crop. We look at the humidity, ensuring that the humidity is kept at the correct level all the time. Temperatures are within very narrow parameters. So on the cultivation side, again, very, very tightly controlled. And Atlas Biotechnology takes a step further by processing the cannabis and extracting the various cannabinoids from the plant. So it has a full lab for doing that, an analytical lab, so we can really kind of cover the whole gamut of cannabis cultivation and processing.
So by the way you pronounce the word process, which we in America would say process, obviously gives an indication that you're Canadian. But many things I want to talk about with you, but one thing I heard that I found sort of disturbing is that Canada insists that all of its flower is irradiated before it goes to sale. Is this still the case? And is it possibly true?
No, that's not the case. But I think the issue that has arisen for a number of producers is that if they aren't controlling that environment, so from the time that when the plant is growing and right through to harvest and curing, if they haven't addressed that humidity and temperature issue, the plant will tend to develop various growths of various.
Yeah, but who in their right mind is not attending to humidity conditions? I mean, who's not? If you're growing cannabis, that's an enormous financial risk, especially if you're growing it at scale. Why would you leave yourself open to that? I don't even understand that.
Very good point. I think the problem there is that so you dial in, say, for example, you dial in your relative humidity, and great. But that's only as good as where the sensor is located in the facility. So what I mean by that is you check your parameters, you check your relative humidity, it might be at 50%, but only at the sensor. So when the crop canopy, because the facility hasn't been designed properly with the correct fans for moving air around, then you have, let's call them hot spots where disease can develop because, again, it's in that spot, it might be really high humidity, although your sensor is saying it's normal humidity.
So are you telling me that a company that's going to invest millions of dollars in how big is your grow facility, for example?
The grow facility, the one we have here in Alberta is 40,000 square feet.
All right, that is not small. No. Are you telling me that some company would actually invest in a facility of that size and not have all these environmental factors in place?
I think there's still a big learning curve for a lot of people. I come from, I hate to tell you how many years in the greenhouse business, over 30. And so in the greenhouses, there has been an evolution with controls. And for example, with the relative humidity control in the good old days, and I still see it in other cannabis operations, you walk in there and what you see are fans that you would have maybe in your living room on a hot summer day, and the fans are rotating and blowing on the crop canopy. That is not the way to achieve more uniformity in the crop with humidity, because what you're doing is drying out the plants that get hit, and the ones 5 feet behind are still kind of moist. So the design is critical, and the industry is learning this in the cannabis industry, but it's about the movement of the air throughout the grow room, uniformly, evenly, and not actually blowing air on the crop. So it seems counterintuitive to a lot of people, but it's very, very important, again, just on that simple parameter of relative humidity.
Let me just clarify with you the radiation point. Is it not the law that cannabis in Canada must be irradiated before going to market?
Nope.
Just clarify that for me. Okay.
But it has to be tested. So we'd have to send our sample into the lab, third party, they check it out, they give us a count, they say, guess what, your cannabis is in great shape, or guess what, your cannabis didn't pass the test. So then I know some producers there will go, okay, great, now what? Well, your radiation is going to be their only solution to get those counts down.
Got it. That's clear. That's very clear. Thank you for clarifying that. So you don't come out of the cannabis business, right? You come out of the growing business. Is this correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So again, my background is greenhouse. First of all, field crop production and vegetables, then greenhouse growing up on a family farm, and then building a big facility where we grow a wide variety of crops. So over the years, I've grown thousands of different varieties of crops. Cannabis, no, I haven't grown cannabis before. But what I found is having that experience with all these crops, some of which are much more difficult to grow, I don't find too many surprises. So I know fertilizer, I know fertilizer programs, I know environments, and that's played well into the cannabis industry. Having said that, I will admit right off the top, there's a lot of people out there that really know their varieties or clones, if you want to call them, of cannabis, and they're far greater at that knowledge about those nuances of those different cannabis cultivars than I am.
But one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because I've always felt that it makes more sense to talk to someone who knows a shit ton about growing as opposed to a shit ton about cannabis if you really want to talk about the plant. Now, obviously, you're probably going to agree with me. That's a leading question, obviously. But make the case for me. Go on.
Well, I think I look at it this way. So when you look at the greenhouse industry, and I look at, and I know there are some great cannabis producers, no question. There's a lot of people growing their basements. Great, wonderful, dedicated people, smart people, know what they're doing. But when you grow up in the greenhouse business with a multitude of crops, I can tell you right now, I've seen every pest issue you can imagine. I've seen it take down crops. I've seen it not touch other crops. I've used a wide variety of pest control products to control these serious pests of plants. So I don't get surprised by that. But what I find is that people that haven't really been exposed to commercial horticulture, in this case, cannabis on a big scale, sometimes they get caught off guard because they don't realize what they're dealing with as far as the pest goes. They do learn over time, but they may not have encountered it with their smaller operations. And then they get hit with these pests, and then they've got to decide, what am I going to spray on there? And there's limited products you can use, both in the U.S. and Canada. Again, I've grown up in a business. I have 2 pesticide applicators licenses. I've done it, I hate to admit it, but since I was 14, I've been spraying crops. So I know what works, what doesn't. And I think that really helps when you get into the cannabis industry to have that background.
Jim, so you're new to cannabis in a certain way then. So tell me 2 of the most surprising things about this plant that you have that really do surprise you about it.
I would say that what surprised me about cannabis is the growth rate. So it's a very, very vigorous plant that can get out of control very, very quickly. So there's a temptation by, I think, some growers to leave the crop longer in the grow room or, say, the greenhouse, and the plant gets so big that it's almost unmanageable. So the important lesson that I've learned is that, wow, you've got to get that crop from vegetative to flowering within a reasonable amount of time so you're not crowding the plants. Again, if you look even up here in Canada, summertime, good old hemp, it'll grow 6 inches in a day at the peak of the season.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it's a pretty rapidly growing crop.
Is cannabis a sensitive plant? If plants have personalities, describe the personality of cannabis, Jim. Is it sensitive, or is it just a big old brute that just keeps growing and taking over?
Well, you know what it's sensitive to? It's sensitive to some of the nutrients we add to it. For example, iron is a critical plant nutrient. So all plants require iron. But cannabis is very sensitive to over applications of iron and even drops in the pH, the acidity of the solution. and the soil that the plant's in. And if you aren't aware of that, the plant will respond by burning. So you'll see all kinds of spotting on the foliage because it's what's called a hyperaccumulator of heavy metals. What that means is that it just sucks up the iron like crazy, given the right amount in the substrate or soil, and given the correct pH, a lower pH in this case. Other plants, they don't suck up iron very easily. And so you got to really feed them. And take a rose, for example. It's inefficient at drawing up iron. So you really feed a lot of iron to it, not cannabis. It's the opposite.
But now, isn't that uptake of metals in the soil, isn't that one of the reasons that hemp is planted around brown fields and sort of nuclear zones?
Yeah.
Because it remediates the soil. Is that correct? Do I have that correct?
Very good point. That's exactly it. So, for example, in Chernobyl, it's a plant for phytoremediation, which means, of course, if there's contamination in the soils, what do? Put some hemp in. They'll draw up some of could potentially be something like arsenic. Even the radionucleotides that were evident in the soils in Chernobyl, they would use the hemp plant for drawing those bad things out of the soil. And if you think about that, that means that, wow, if they're really adept at doing that, then the grower's got to be thinking about the inputs that he is providing for his cannabis plants to ensure that he can verify what's in there and not exceed the levels that would cause injury to the plant. And again, if the fertilizer solution, it hasn't really been tested for the bad heavy metals like the arsenics and cadmium, the grower could be in serious trouble when he has his plants tested, because here in Canada, they check for the heavy metals, and if it exceeds a certain amount, that crop is rejected.
So how does it work? How does it work if you are at Chernobyl? You just dump a bunch of hemp seed in the soil, let it grow, cut it down, keep dumping more in? How does it work?
I would say, not having been there and seen it, but I would say that's a really, really good sort of a picture of what they would do there. The cannabis seed grows, it germinates very quickly. In the Atlas facility here, I put a seed in, a day later, it has a radical or root shooting out. Amazing. A lot of seed that I've been used to in the greenhouses doesn't do that. So you could broadcast that seed onto a field and just let that hemp do its thing. And then once it gets to a certain size, I would suggest they would probably leave it till the end of the season because it is so vigorous, and just take the plant out and dispose of it in a environmentally friendly way.
Interesting. Very interesting indeed. So you don't grow are you growing specific strains in Canada, or are you not doing that? Are you just growing?
Yeah, we are. And so again, our more experienced people who've been in the cannabis, who know their cannabis varieties, have searched for the very, very best varieties based on primarily THC and CBD, but because of our medicinal focus, really CBD is our thing. We're looking for higher levels of CBD in our crops.
How high are you getting in your crops these days?
So if you look at in Alberta here, up in Canada, outdoor cultivation hemp plants, you'll see 2-3% CBD. Some of the varieties that we have in are running up to 20% CBD. That's
amazing, right?
It is amazing. And so we're focused on now propagating those called cultivars or cultivated varieties, and having a good supply of those for our market, which is demanding CBD.
And do these varieties have names?
Right now, we got them numbered. We kind of have it under our hat. And interesting thing, though, about cannabis, and it applies both to the U.S. and Canada. So I've grown up, again, greenhouse business. And when I buy a petunia coming out of the States or coming out of Canada or wherever it is, those varieties are protected. So they're registered, protected. I've got to pay a royalty. They're not patented plants, but they are protected. To date, cannabis isn't protected.
Right.
It's going to come. It's going to happen. I have no doubt. When that happens, you're going to see all the names fully out there. You have to have, we have a plant breeder in our facility who has a PhD, and he's done a lot of plant breeding on corn and canola up here. And you need to have 5 years experience. You need to have a PhD in plant breeding. And then down the road, when the regulations evolve, you will be able to have protected varieties that you can sell and get a royalty from. Right now, no. I mean, you can't even be certain with the cannabis plant that the name that's ascribed to it isn't.
Of course.
Variety.
But Jim, what is canola?
Oh yeah, it's kind of a contract. It's a portmanteau, I think, of Canadian oil something, and it's really what it's. So Canada's developed this plant from rapeseed. Maybe you recognize that name, but
it's rapeseed, which is mustard, which is really mustard seed, isn't it? Rapeseed.
Right. Yeah, it's a high quality oil, and so the driving force with canola breeding is to ensure, of course, it's a vigorous plant, but to get the most oil you can per acre from the crop. So, so I think the plant breeders, you need them if you're going to look to the future in the cannabis business. I think genetics, protection of genetics, is going to be a really big factor.
Most of our listeners are probably, let's say, not growing industrial cannabis. They're not growing the quantity or the volume of that. But it's really interesting that in my travels through the world of cannabis, some of the most interesting people I know are those that they just love to grow. There's almost this genetic impulse just to grow things. And those who love to grow cannabis, they just really love to do it. It's like some crazy, it's way beyond a hobby.
Right. It's certainly
it goes to obsession, right?
It is, yeah. And I think that there are some fabulous growers out there, so dedicated. I always say though, growing, when you have plants, they don't take weekends off. And the really passionate growers, the ones that do the best job, understand that. The plants don't care if it's a long weekend. Plants don't care if it's Sunday. And so you've got to be there checking on them, looking for any signs of things that might be going wrong on the crop. And the people that do that get the best crops, get the best results from their crops. And it's not, again, not the kind of, no plant can just sit there and not be checked upon on a regular basis. So if you look at the Atlas facility, 7 days a week, we got people out. I go in on the weekends, check the crop out. And yes, we're really highly controlled with the computers and environment, et cetera, but there's nothing to replace walking through that crop, checking it out, and the absolute pleasure of walking through a really high quality crop. I never get tired of that. When I walk through that crop, it puts a smile on my face. I just love going to each grow room and just smelling, seeing, and seeing a nice vigorous crop. So yeah.
Do you think you're a particular breed of human that has a genetic disposition towards this?
Well, I think the way it all started was my mother said because we had the market garden operation, that when she'd go out to the field to weed the crop, I would be on her back hanging on. So from a very young age, I think I got a love of the earth and the love of plants. And I mean, I went to university and took plant science as a result. I love science. I love the science of plants. Endlessly fascinating.
Do you have any advice other than tending to your crops minute by minute, day by day, no weekends off? Is there any advice to a home grower? I mean, you're growing indoors, so many people do grow indoors, obviously. Any way to sort of ensure the vigor, the sensitivity, the success of your efforts?
I think the two things that if you get them right, then you're 90% of the way there for home use. The two things, lighting and the substrate, or I call it the soil. You get those two correct, you're going to be well on your way to having a really good harvest. So
please continue, please.
Yeah, let's say if you look at this soil or substrate, what I find is that when things go sideways with the plant, and I ask about the soil, a lot of people will say, "Oh, I just used potting soil," and my response to that is always, "There's no such standard, no such thing as just potting soil. There are all kinds of different qualities of potting soil, and you've got to know what's going into that mix." So what I've seen in the past would be damage from herbicides because somebody put in something from a field. Somebody used manure that was contaminated. Somebody didn't realize that a particular manure or organic fertilizer is very high in sodium or other salts. You've got to get that right. So if you get the high quality mixtures from reputable suppliers, great. you're off to a good start. You could tweak and change a bit later on, but you got to know your source, your supplier of it, and have verifiable data on what's in there. The second thing is the lighting. Plants have to have light, and fertilizer is not plant food. Light is plant food. Plants have figured out how to get their food from the sun. We eat the plants and we harvest what they harvested from the sun. That's their food. With cannabis interior cultivation, oftentimes people will put in maybe the right lighting, but it's too far away from the crop, or poor quality lighting, and the plants can never reach their maximum quality and yield because they simply are starving for their food, the sunlight. Fertilizer is the third thing, and that's really on the priority list, number 3. But get a good quality fertilizer and don't overdo it. What I find with cannabis is that it doesn't require as much fertilizer as is what is typically recommended.
So is a particular type of fertilizer you like?
Well, I think a lot of times the people that grow cannabis in their basements or as a hobby will tend to go to the water-soluble fertilizers. One that comes to mind is 20-20, 20-20-20. Why is it so popular? I always say because people can remember it. Same 3 numbers. The plant does not need that strict ratio. What appears to be the best for cannabis is a fertilizer that has, at the beginning, in the leafy stage, a higher first number, a lower middle number, and a reasonably high last number, the potassium. As you move into flowering, you drop the first number. You don't have to increase the middle number, but pump up the last number, the potassium. That produces the highest quality cannabis. Now, there's all kinds of fertilizers up the market that will do that. If you just go in and check it out, you can see something that will match sort of that recipe. You can, again, use your organic fertilizers if you like. Again, if you know what's in there. That's critical. You have to know what's in that fertilizer.
Let's go back to lighting for a second. It's a very expensive proposition to be using whatever they're called, high-powered sodium lighting, right? It's extremely expensive. It's a total drain on the environment. What's new here? Is there anything new that will reduce the cost and the absolute wattage of this stuff? Because I've read reports that it's, cannabis growing takes up an enormous amount of electricity. I think there was some statistic that it takes 3% of America's electrical usage. I don't know if that's true, but you tell me.
Well, they certainly do demand lots of light, and you can't skimp on the light. I think the exciting thing is, and maybe it's because of the burgeoning cannabis industry, that there has been a lot of research into LED lighting. If you were to talk to me, I'll even say 2 years ago about the LEDs, light-emitting diodes, I'd be kind of going, they're not really there. They're not as good as the HPS, high-pressure sodium lights, the yellowy-looking lights. They're really good. They give off a lot of heat. So they're not, a lot of the energy going into HPS lights is evolved as waste heat. And so a much smaller proportion is going to usable plant light. But what's happened in the last few years, the big companies and some medium-sized companies have really, really done a lot of research on LED lights, cost down. Yeah. And they've really come up as far as the energy going in ratio to the light energy that the plant can use coming out. Exciting. You'll see now efficiencies where the LEDs are using a quarter of the light the HPS lights use. And wow. I think a downward trend, and we're going to keep seeing, again, better and more efficient LED lights. Spectrum so if you look at the plant, the light spectrum, you look at white light, well, of course, there's red and blue and green and yellow, a whole bit in there. And there's been a lot of focus on red and blue lights. And with more research, we're going to see where we can really fine-tune the spectrum and, again, increase efficiency of the lights. Very, very exciting.
So if you're a home grower, what kind of lighting should you be looking at?
Well, some people are investing in the great big 1,000-watt HPS light that can light up a basement. If you do have enough of the fluorescent tubes, the skinnier, what they call T5 fluorescent tubes, if you have enough of them, they can grow surprisingly good cannabis. However, there are many LEDs for home use, And if it were me, that's what I'd be investing in, would be those LED lights for home use.
Any particular wattage or any particular number or type?
Yeah. The key thing here, if you're a committed grower, I'm going to recommend this. Get a light meter that's geared to measuring the usable plant light. It will cost you, it might cost you a couple of $100, but it's well worth it. So what that tells you when you put that meter up at crop canopy height, it'll tell you how much usable plant light you're getting. And without making it too scientific and confusing, but it's worth knowing this. And you can, maybe a lot of people will know this, but you measure it in micromoles of light. And if you have 500, you're in great shape right at the top of the canopy. And if you light that crop for 18 hours a day, 6 hours of darkness, when you want to get it growing and leafy, super. You maintain that light, 12 hours of light during the day, 12 hours of continuous darkness at night. The plant will kick into flowering and have all the light energy it needs to grow high quality cannabis and high yielding cannabis.
Jim, that's amazing. Thank you. Is there anything else that surprises you, shocks you, interests you, appalls you about growing the cannabis plant?
I think the one interesting, there's many, many interesting things, but it's the fragrances that you get when you go into a grow room.
How about that, huh?
The other coolest thing, walking by row upon row of cannabis and smelling the lemony smell, and then coming across one single plant that smells like bubblegum. Going, where did that come from? I will never, ever tire of walking through those rooms. I will never, ever tire of learning from books and other people. Nobody knows it all, and I just cherish every moment I spend in the plants.
That's so great. But isn't it amazing how accurate some of the names of the strains are? Isn't it incredible? Like you can identify bubblegum or a diesel odor.
Exactly.
You go, oh yeah, right, exactly. It's exactly what that is. Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And my hat off to all those guys and men and women who persevered, bred those crops, produced these outstanding varieties. Thank you.
How about in the face of some pretty overwhelming, issues like prison, like helicopters flying over you, firebombing your fields? We're talking some pretty amazing things, don't you think?
I think so. And again, amazing people that persevered. I mean, if that had not happened, we'd be used to be scrambling around with hemp varieties and looking around trying to find things we can grow properly. So the pioneers did it, and we can reap the benefits from their hard work.
They really persevered, and they're really. I hope they get compensated, at least through the law and through expungement and all of the other horrors that the war on drugs and prohibition has created.
Yes, got that right.
Jim Holt, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating, and I want you to stay in touch with us, okay?
Great pleasure to talk with you, Joe. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
As Joe and I continue to do the podcast, we're getting dozens of emails daily about new products or promotion opportunities that might be interesting. We're a pretty picky lot, so we don't pass them all along to you, but every now and then one merits our attention, and we'd like to be able to share it. If you would like to receive information like that, you can join our mailing list by visiting www.bravenewweed.com and signing up today.
So, Matthew, have you ever been inspired to start an indoor grow?
I've never, I'm into horticulture. I like growing plants and vegetables when I had space and room. As far as the indoor grow thing, I think that there are some serious limitations for a regular guy to just aluminum foil line his basement and go to town. But
I think Jim makes that fairly clear, right? That it's more than just a little bit of aluminum and a little bit of water, right?
Absolutely. And I do think that the most important takeaway from this is, maybe not the guy who's sitting on the couch right now thinking to himself that he wants to grow, 8 or 10 plants or something like that, but people who are genuinely curious and interested about breaking into this new world of cannabis cultivation on a commercial level, right? I think that it's a cautionary tale for people who maybe already have those 10 plants, or maybe you have 20 plants, but the move from there to a commercial facility that can produce commercial amounts of cannabis is actually huge.
It's a radical move. And, sort of on that note, I want to tease the next episode for a second, because it's really interesting. We remember we did that piece on Thailand and growing and helping small farmers, and organic sun-grown cannabis versus the pharmaceutical stuff, right? So we got a call from a very interesting guy named Narbi Alexandrian, who happens to run a very large venture capital fund out of Canada. It's called Canopy Rivers, and it's associated with Canopy Growth. And he listened to the podcast, and he had some comments on it, and he had some pushback on it. So I invited him to join us to discuss what his take on that episode was. And it's very interesting, because this is a guy who's really seeing all next generation cannabis stuff. This is somebody who, has a lot of money to spend, and who people are going to say, please invest in me. So I'm really eager to share that episode with you and the listeners, to hear his take on sun-grown versus industrial, developing world versus industrial world. These are really interesting topics that I think no one's really talking about, but that Narbi has a great perspective on.
Interesting.
I think you'll like it.
So that sounds great, Joe, and I really look forward to joining you again on the next episode. I hope you listeners out there will join us as well and continue to like, follow, share, and support the podcast. Of course, you can always do so on all the social media, but if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you all again, please visit patreon.com/bravenewweed. Check out the great content we have going up there. Look at the reward tiers, and if you can afford it, if you have, that $1 a month like rattling around in the bottom of your pocket, please consider becoming a patron and supporting the Brave New Weed podcast today.
And if you have that $20 a month rattling around in your pocket, you can do that too.
Hey, if you have that $100, come on out to New York and let's go out to dinner. How about that?
Perfect. That would be great. It's be our pleasure to take you. Matthew, have a great week. I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Joe. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.